It started like any other quiet morning in the neighborhood until the power suddenly cut out. No warning, no explanation, just silence and confusion. Families stepped outside, glancing around in frustration, wondering if it was a citywide outage. But this wasn't a city issue. It was the HOA, and they never told anyone at first. People assumed it was a glitch, maybe a blown transformer. But then whispers started. The Homeowners Association had ordered maintenance work and decided to shut off the power without alerting the residents. No emails, no notices, nothing on the community board. Just darkness. Inside one home, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter was lighting a candle to help her see. She lived alone, just trying to make it through the outage. But what she didn't know was that her oxygen machine had already been off for too long, and the backup battery wasn't holding. A few houses down, a father was cooking breakfast for his kids when the gas stove sparked strangely in the dim light. Moments later, the smoke alarms, so without power, stayed silent as flames began to spread. By the time neighbors noticed the smoke, it was already too late to stop what came next. And that's when the HOA, realizing the consequences of their silent decision, panicked. Scrambling to cover their tracks, they tried to spin the story, calling it a technical issue. But residents knew better. What really happened that morning? Why did the HOA make such a reckless choice? And who would be held accountable for the damage done not just to property, but to people's lives? Stay tuned, because what unfolded next left the entire neighborhood shaken and exposed the ugly truth behind a decision no one agreed to. The strange part was, this wasn't the first time the HOA had made quiet decisions without asking anyone. Over the past year, they had slowly started changing how things were done, removing community bulletin boards, limiting resident meetings, and pushing updates only through an app that most of the elderly residents didn't even use. People complained, but nothing ever changed. Now, after this power cut and the fire, those complaints were turning into serious questions. Mrs. Carter's neighbors, especially a young woman named Emily, were furious. Emily had grown close to Mrs. Carter after moving in last year. She was the one who found her struggling to breathe that morning and called emergency services. If they had just told us, she kept repeating, shaking with frustration, this could have been avoided. But no one from the HOA was answering calls. Meanwhile, the fire damage was worse than expected. The father who had been cooking, Marcus, watched as firefighters pulled apart parts of his kitchen. His two kids sat on the curb, wrapped in blankets, scared but unharmed. The smell of smoke still clung to the air hours later. Residents gathered in small groups, talking, guessing, wondering if this was just incompetence or something more. Some claimed they had heard rumors of a contractor dispute. Others said the HOA had been trying to cut costs by skipping safety checks. But no one really knew. And still, no one from the board had shown up in person. The community's trust, already fragile, was now on the edge of collapse. People started pulling out their phones, recording what was left of their homes, hoping to document everything, not just for insurance, but for proof. Because the more they looked into it, the more it felt like this wasn't just a mistake. It was something much deeper. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with tension. Several families had filed official complaints with the city, and a few were already speaking with local news outlets. Emily had taken it a step further. She started digging through old HOA emails, minutes from board meetings, anything she could find. What she discovered only added more fuel to the fire. 3 months ago, there had been a brief mention of temporary infrastructure updates buried in a long newsletter. No mention of power cuts, no emergency planning. And strangely, the board had approved the contract in a private sessions, something they weren't supposed to do under community bylaws. Emily shared the screenshots in a group chat of residents. And soon, people were asking why none of them had voted on this, or even heard about it. Meanwhile, Marcus reached out to the fire department. He wanted the official report, not just for insurance, but to see if the cause of the fire was tied to the outage. The initial findings hinted at a gas leak, something that could have been worsened by the sudden loss of electricity. And that raised more questions. Did the HOA know this might happen? Others in the neighborhood started remembering strange things too, like the generator that had been installed near the HOA office recently, or the fact that the board president's house still had partial power the morning of the outage. Coincidence or something else? Tempers were rising. Some residents wanted to demand a full audit of the HOA. Others feared retaliation. They'd seen how quickly fines showed up when someone spoke out before. But now the stakes felt different. This wasn't about a mailbox violation or lawn height. This was about safety, transparency, and the feeling that someone was hiding the truth. By the end of the week, the neighborhood felt like it was sitting on a ticking clock. The HOA had finally released a short statement, blaming a miscommunication with contractors for the unannounced power shutoff. But no one was buying it. Residents were now organizing late-night meetings in driveways, passing around printed documents, old newsletters, screenshots, anything they could use to build a timeline of what really happened. Trust had turned into suspicion, and suspicion into determination. Emily kept pressing. She filed a formal records request under the community bylaws, asking for all correspondence related to the power work. When she received the documents, she noticed something: a damned email thread between the HOA board and a private contractor that mentioned a cost-saving trial blackout. To avoid city inspection fees, the words chilled her. It wasn't just looked deliberate. Marcus, on the other hand, had spoken to the gas company, and the technician had quietly told him that there had been a service notice ignored months ago. A small leak flagged, left unrepaired. That same line ran through the part of the house that caught fire. People were putting the pieces together, but then came the twist no one expected. Late one night, the HOA president's home was broken into. Not ransacked, just searched, nothing taken. Just a drawer left open, some files missing. The next morning, she was gone. Car, phone, everything. Disappeared without saying a word. Rumors exploded. Had she fled? Was someone trying to silence her? Or was she just scared of what was coming next? The fire had been the spark, but now the neighborhood was on edge, waiting for the next blow. Everyone felt it. Something bigger was hiding behind this blackout, and whatever it was about to come out. The day after the HOA president vanished, things took an even darker turn. A certified letter arrived at several homes on the same street, marked from a legal office most had never heard of. The letter claimed the HOA had filed an internal liability waiver weeks before the outage, stating that any damages caused during infrastructure tests would not be the board's responsibility. No one in the community had ever seen or signed such a document. But now it seemed someone had quietly filed it on their behalf. Emily rushed over to Marcus's house with a copy in hand. "This has our names on it," she said, pointing at the printed list of residents. They forged it. The shock hit hard. This wasn't just about mismanagement anymore. It looked like someone had planned this plan to avoid blame before anything even happened. Meanwhile, the local news team that had briefly visited days earlier returned, this time with cameras rolling. As reporters interviewed residents about the house fire, the missing HOA president, and now the legal waivers, tension in the air was electric. People were no longer just angry, they were scared. And then came the second twist. A former board member would quietly resign too. Months before the incident, reached out anonymously. In a recorded voicemail leaked to several residents, he claimed there had been private meetings discussing how to cut maintenance budgets without alerting the community. He warned of missing documents, backdated approvals, and pressure to stay silent. Now the neighborhood was fully awake. The conflict was no longer just between residents and a secretive board, it was between truth and cover-up. Everyone realized they weren't just dealing with a blackout or a fire. They were dealing with a system built on silence, and whatever came next would expose everything. Everything came to a head during an emergency town hall meeting. It's called not by the HOA, but by the residents themselves. Dozens gathered in the community park, holding printed emails, copies of the forged liability letters, and recordings from the anonymous ex-board member. For the first time, people who had never spoken to each other were standing side by side, demanding answers. Just when tensions seemed ready to boil over, a police cruiser pulled up. Out stepped the missing HOA president, courted, not arrested. The officer explained that she had checked into a hotel for safety after receiving threats. But as she faced the crowd, her expression told a different story, one of guilt and pressure. In a trembling voice, she admitted what many had suspected. The board had approved the blackout to avoid paying for mandatory city inspections. They thought it would be harmless, a controlled outage. But when the fire happened, panic set in. The forged documents weren't her idea, she claimed. They were prepared by the HOA's legal advisor, who had since stopped answering calls and vanished. Just as the residents began to process it all, a man in the crowd raised his hand. Quiet, older, mostly unnoticed. He introduced himself as a retired city inspector and revealed that the HOA's private contractor had also been under investigation for falsifying inspection records in other communities. This wasn't an isolated case. Gasps filled the air. The fire, the cover-up, the vanishing attorney, it was all part of something larger. The truth had finally come out, but the story wasn't over. Authorities were now involved, and the HOA board faced a full investigation. The power was back on in the neighborhood. But now, every light revealed more than anyone expected. And what started with silence had ended in something no one would ever forget. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to slowly return to normal, though the scars, both emotional and physical, remained. The investigation into the HOA's actions uncovered years of shady decisions, hidden documents, and quiet deals with unlicensed contractors. Several board members stepped down under pressure, and legal action was filed, not just by residents, but also by the city. The forged liability waivers were confirmed, and the lawyer behind them was eventually tracked down in another state, now facing multiple charges. Emily, who had once just been a quiet neighbor, became a community hero. She helped organize a new residents committee focused on transparency and rebuilding trust. Marcus and his kids moved back into their repaired home, and although the memory of the fire still lingered, they finally felt safe again. Mrs. Carter made a full recovery thanks to Emily's quick thinking. She even surprised everyone by showing up at the first official meeting of the new HOA, walking slowly but proudly, with a handwritten note thanking the neighborhood for standing up not just for her, but for each other. The retired city inspector helped guide the community through safety checks and improvements, making sure no one would ever be left in the dark, again literally or otherwise. What started as a silent power outage turned into a powerful awakening. It reminded everyone how important it is to ask questions, to speak up, and to stay connected. A neighborhood isn't just a collection of homesits, the people inside them, looking out for one another. And while the lights eventually came back on, it was the truth that truly lit up the community in the end. A hard lesson, but one that left the neighborhood stronger, wiser, and finally heard.